Hello, and warm welcome to this session today. Welcome to Nesta's Bioacademy. And today, the main objective of this video is to take us through the process of diffusion. We are going to learn the meaning of diffusion. We are going to learn the factors affecting the rate of diffusion. And then finally, we will look at the role that this important process plays in living things. If you can remember, in the previous video, we learned about the cell membrane, the structure of the cell membrane, the processes through which materials move in and out of the cells. And we discussed and said that while the cell carries out so many important processes, these processes require intake of materials, and once these processes are complete, we also have important biomolecules produced inside the cells, which need to find their way outside the cells and into the regions where they are needed. So we said it was important for us to discuss the processes through which materials move in and out of the cells. And we listed three main processes through which materials move in and out of the cells. That was diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. If you have forgotten some of the aspects we learned, then you can review the previous video before proceeding to look into this. So the main objective of this lesson is that by the end of it, you need to be able to define what diffusion is. You need to be able to describe the factors affecting the rates of diffusion, and there is need for you to be able to describe the role of diffusion in living things. Diffusion is something that occurs around us, and there's so many observations around us which demonstrate diffusion. Like if you look at the illustration on your screen right now, what do you make of it? What do you make of it? What can you observe when we drop that ink into that beaker containing distilled water? You realize that over time, the red color of the ink spreads from the point where the drop of the ink has been introduced all the way to a point where now the ink molecules become evenly distributed. If you look at now the final illustration on this end, you realize we have a uniform color distribution there, meaning the dye or the ink molecules have been evenly distributed. This is a classical example of diffusion, but we have so many illustrations of diffusion happening around us. There are sometimes when you pass around or someone passes by you and then you're like, wow, that's a nice cologne. You are able to smell that because of diffusion. You are always able to enjoy the nice scent of the nice aroma of tea because of diffusion. When you drop the tea bag into the hot water, the tea molecules end up diffusing across into the hot water, giving you the nice taste of ketepa. Whenever we breathe, whenever you're able to get some good aroma of any deliciously prepared meal, it is diffusion that facilitates that. And our gaseous exchange and all that depends heavily on the process of diffusion. So based on this earlier illustration, we can define diffusion as the process by which molecules move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Molecules will always tend to move from the region where they are highly concentrated to the region where they are lowly concentrated. And this is what we mean by diffusion. It is essential to note that our survival is very much dependent on the process of diffusion because without diffusion, our body, organs, tissues cannot function effectively because the materials that these organs and tissues require often move to these tissues and organs through the process of diffusion. In this illustration shown on your screen, we are seeing molecules of dye diffusing from one end where they are highly concentrated to the other region where they are lowly concentrated, if you look at this illustration here. And diffusion of molecules is always very, very much independent. And that is why you can see in this illustration here again, we have these molecules, the purple-colored molecules diffusing from this end to this end, where they're from this end where they're highly concentrated, to this end where they're lowly concentrated. Similarly, the orange-colored molecules move from this end where they're highly concentrated to this end where they're lowly concentrated. So the diffusion of molecules is always independent. It all depends on the concentration difference between the two regions we are talking about. And that is why at any given time, we will always be having molecules diffusing into the cells, and we will also be having molecules diffusing out of the cells. Some of the important features to note about diffusion is that diffusion involves movement of molecules along a concentration gradient. When molecules move from the region of high concentration to the region of low concentration, we say the movement is along a concentration gradient. That is important to note because that will be a sharp contrast between diffusion and active transport, which we will later on learn involves movement against the concentration gradient. And being that it involves movement of molecules along a concentration gradient, that is from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, diffusion is therefore a passive process. When we say it's a passive process, what we mean is that it does not require energy to take place. I want you to imagine my two friends here playing. We have Tom here, and we have Mary playing here. So they are passing boxes and balls between them. And if Tom is to let this package roll over towards Mary, Tom will not have to apply any energy. All he will need to do is simply to let it be, and it will roll down to where Mary is. But whatever Mary has to pass to Tom, Mary will have to apply energy. So when we always move molecules from a region of low concentration to high concentration, it is always against a concentration gradient, and usually energy is required. But when you move molecules from the region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, this movement of molecules along the concentration gradient, and as a result, energy is not always required. All that is always required for diffusion to take place is concentration gradient. That is there a difference in concentration of molecules between the two regions we are talking about? Concentration gradient refers to the difference in concentration of molecules of a particular kind between any two regions. It's important to note that if the concentration of molecules between any two regions is the same, then we are not going to have net diffusion. This is to mean, assuming let's have a case whereby I have these molecules in this part as shown, and then also on this end, I also have a similar concentration of molecules, then we are not going to have any net diffusion. Though it is important to note that molecules can always move freely. So we expect molecules to move from point A to point B. We are also expecting the molecules from point B, they can move to point A, but we are not going to have any net diffusion taking place because the movement from point A to B and the movement from point B to A will be equal. So for diffusion to take place, there is always need for there to be a difference in concentration of molecules between the two regions. Diffusion can also occur in solids, it can also occur in liquids, and it can also occur in gases. And because it does not require energy, we can have diffusion occurring in living tissues and also in non-living things. And also a point that is worth noting is that diffusion, unlike osmosis, does not necessarily require a semi-permeable membrane. it can take place across a semi-permeable membrane, or it can take place even if there is no semi-permeable membrane between the two regions of differing concentrations. Many times, as you will learn further, osmosis involves movement of molecules across a semi-permeable membrane. And so this usually brings in a lot of confusion when sometimes students see a whisking tubing or any semi-permeable membrane. They always easily tend to think the process under investigation is osmosis, but in most cases, diffusion also can occur across a semi-permeable membrane. And I want us to review this very briefly. A very common experiment you're likely to encounter is what I will refer to as the starch iodine diffusion experiment. Here we use a starch solution, we use iodine solution, and we mostly use whisking tubing. Whisking tubing, remember, is a semi-permeable membrane. And background to this information you need to know, starch solution usually tends to be clear, relatively clear, or it can be cloudy, or it can appear like some sort of a white suspension depending on the type um, on the level of refinement of the starch powder we are using. Iodine solution, on the other hand, depending on the concentration, can appear yet to be yellow or brown. Now, anytime iodine molecules and starch molecules interact, they form a starch iodine complex. And this starch iodine complex is always blue-black in color. And this is always actually one of the main confirmatory tests we always use for starch. That is, you can simply use an iodine solution to test whether a whether a solution contains starch, because anytime iodine molecules come into contact with starch molecules, a blue-black starch iodine complex is always formed. So we can have our setup in two ways. You can set up our experiment in two ways. If we look at this illustration in case A and also compare it with case B, in case A, we have iodine solution inside the whisking tubing, and then we have starch solution in the beaker. Or for the case B, we are having iodine solution in the beaker, but you're having starch solution inside the whisking tubing. And if you were to allow these setups to stand after some time, you will always realize in case A, inside the beaker, the color changes to blue-black. But in the whisking tubing, the color remains brown. For case B, in the beaker, the color remains brown, but in the whisking tubing, it turns blue-black. So what could be the possible explanations for these observations? This is a case of diffusion across a semi-permeable membrane. If you look carefully, you realize iodine molecules are in the whisking tubing. So they're at a higher concentration here, and the starch molecules are also in the beaker. They're at a higher concentration in the beaker. So naturally, we'll be expecting starch molecules to diffuse from the beaker here into the whisking tubing where we have the iodine solution. The iodine molecules are also at a higher concentration inside the whisking tubing, and we expect them to diffuse out of the whisking tubing into the beaker. So if we look at the observations, we realize that inside the beaker, there'll be blue-black coloration. It means iodine gets to diffuse into the beaker where we have the starch solution. But inside the whisking tubing, we are having the color remaining brown. Why is it remaining brown? This means that starch molecules are not able to diffuse across the whisking tubing into the iodine solution. What does this tell you? This tells you that the whisking tubing is selectively or semi-permeable. Iodine molecules are too small in size compared to the starch molecules. So the iodine molecules are able to diffuse across the whisking tubing, but the starch molecules are too large. They are not able to diffuse across. So the observation here is that the explanation here is that the iodine molecules are too small in size, so they diffuse from the whisking tubing where they're at a high concentration into the beaker where they are at a low concentration, hence the color turns blue-black inside the beaker. But inside the whisking tubing, the color remains brown because the starch molecules are too large in size, so they are not able to diffuse across the whisking tubing because the whisking tubing is semi-permeable. Coming over to this other side, the observations are now reversed. In the beaker now, where you are having the iodine solution, the color remains brown, but inside the whisking tubing where you are having starch, the color turns blue-black. Again, if starch molecules were able to diffuse across the whisking tubing, you will also be expecting the iodine solution in the beaker to turn blue-black. But this observation strengthens the understanding and the notion that the starch molecules are too large and therefore they're not able to diffuse across the whisking tubing. So again, this means that the iodine molecules in the beaker, being that they are too small in size and they're at a high concentration in the beaker, they are able to diffuse across the whisking tubing and into the starch solution. And by forming the starch iodine complex, a blue-black color is observed there. So this is a common experiment that involves diffusion across the semi-permeable membrane. You can refer to your primary course books, KLB Form 1 Biology, where you can also learn further about another demonstration of diffusion process, and that is by using potassium manganate 7 crystals. With this understanding, it is important for us to proceed further and review the factors affecting the rate of diffusion. And listed on your screen are the most common factors affecting the rate of diffusion. We have temperature, we have thickness of the membranes, we have size of the diffusing molecules, we have the surface area to volume ratio, and we also have the surface area. How will these factors affect the rate of diffusion? Let's explore further. From your chemistry, you learn that an increase in temperature tends to increase the kinetic energy of molecules. So an increase in temperature will always increase kinetic energy of the molecules. This makes them to move faster, and this increases the rate of diffusion. It means the converse is also true. A decrease in temperature will decrease the kinetic energy of the molecules, making them to move slowly, reducing the rate of diffusion. If I can give an examiner tip here that is important for you to note. A very common question you're likely to meet is explain how temperature affects the rate of diffusion. This could be for 2 marks. And then a very common response you're likely to give is that the higher the temperature, the higher the rate of diffusion, and vice versa is true, or while the lower the temperature, the lower the rate of diffusion. Unfortunately, this one will give you a 0 because you are not explaining how the temperature brings about this observation. So in your response to a question of this kind, you need to be able to explain that an increase in temperature increases kinetic energy of the molecules, making them to move faster, increasing diffusion rate. And that is how you score in that question. The second factor that affects the rate of diffusion is the size of the molecules. We always expect the smaller and lighter particles to move faster, leading to a faster rate of diffusion. So again, that is crucial to understand them. And the other factor we need to mention is the concentration gradient. The greater the concentration gradient, the greater the rate of diffusion. If I could maybe give a simple illustration here, I want us to imagine that this is an area of concentration of molecules, and this is another area of concentration of molecules. This is case scenario A. If I represent scenario B, I also want us to imagine a case whereby these ones are diffusing molecules, and this is also another different region. So if you look at both cases, it's obvious that this region here has a greater concentration than this. So we expect the direction of diffusion to go that way. If I come to this other end, you also expect the direction of diffusion to go that way. But here, the difference in concentration is greater compared to the difference in concentration. So the gradient is higher here and the gradient is lower here. So you expect faster rate of diffusion here and a slower rate of diffusion. That is, if the difference in concentration of molecules between any two regions is very large, then we expect the rate of diffusion to be faster there compared to a case where the concentration gradient is less. Then, of course, you also have thickness of membranes. Just as we have established, diffusion can also occur across membranes. So across thinner membranes, the distance of diffusion is reduced. So when the distance of diffusion is reduced, we are going to expect a faster rate of diffusion. And the rate of diffusion is also dependent on the surface area. What is the extent? What is the surface area over which diffusion takes place? A larger surface area will always result in a larger rate of diffusion because the particles of the molecules will be diffusing over a large distance. Also related to surface area, but is different, is the case of surface area to volume ratio. And here, the larger the surface area to volume ratio, the greater the rate of diffusion. What this implies, if I can explain this further, I want you to imagine a cube, a very small cube represented in this sketch. And I also want you to imagine another very large cube, also once again represented by this sketch. If molecules are to be moved across them, let me say there's a particle at the center, and at the center, in both cases, the distance that will be taken by this molecule to move all the way to the external surrounding, and the distance that will be taken for this to move to the external surrounding. Here, the distance, D1 is smaller compared to D2, which is larger. So it will take a longer time for the molecules to diffuse out of this confinement, but it will take a shorter time for it to diffuse out. Now, when you move from smaller to larger, usually the surface area to volume ratio, usually it decreases. And that is further illustrated by this. You can see the surface, for considering this cube measuring 1 millimeter each side, the surface area to volume ratio is 6 to 1. When it measures 2 millimeters, the surface area to volume ratio is 3 to 1. And when each side is measuring 4 millimeters, you can see the surface area to volume ratio coming down to 1.5 to 1. So again, what this is implied is any molecule moving out of this confinement will move through a shorter distance, but one that is to move from the center, for example, to the outer environment will take a longer time. So the larger the surface area to volume ratio, the greater the rate of diffusion. And if you can bring this into perspective in living things, we therefore expect the rate of diffusion to be much greater in smaller organisms compared to the larger organisms. The rate of diffusion will be very, very slow. Now we can wind up on the process of diffusion by looking at the role of diffusion in living things. What makes diffusion very important in living things? One, diffusion plays a very important role in gases exchange in living things. This is both in plants and in animals. In plants, gases exchange majorly takes place within the leaves. So during the day, when the plants are carrying out photosynthesis, they always use up a lot of carbon dioxide inside the leaves to manufacture food. So at any given time during the day, there'll be a low concentration of carbon dioxide inside the leaves and a greater concentration outside. So the greater concentration of carbon dioxide outside in the atmosphere and a lower concentration inside the leaves will lead to diffusion of carbon dioxide into the leaves. And again, during the day, when they are carrying out a lot of photosynthesis, remember, plants always produce oxygen gas as a byproduct. So this means there will always be a greater concentration of oxygen gas inside the leaves compared to the surrounding. So consequently, we expect oxygen gas to be diffusing out of the leaves. But that is during the day. At night, when now we don't have sufficient light, respiration becomes the dominant process. And because of that one now, it will now be the reversed process. Now, carbon dioxide tends to diffuse out of the leaves and oxygen gas tends to diffuse into the leaves. Similarly, in animals like us, remember gases exchange takes place inside our lungs. And inside our lungs, we have structures we call alveoli, commonly just known as our air sacs. Also, gases exchange usually takes place there to enable us get rid of carbon dioxide and take in oxygen, which we always require for respiration. In plants also, diffusion carries out a very important role in absorption of mineral salts by plant roots from the soil. Plants will always need to absorb mineral salts from the soil. And the mineral salts which are at a higher concentration inside the soil than in the root hair cell sap will always be absorbed by the plants through the process of diffusion. But as we will later on learn also, absorption of mineral salts is also carried out by through the process of active transport. We will understand that one in the subsequent videos. It's also important to note that diffusion plays a very critical role in absorption of end products of digestion from ileum into the bloodstream. Whenever you eat that plate of nicely prepared ugali and beef, these foods have to be digested down to the simplest forms which can be taken up by the bodies. So digestion always becomes completed at the ileum, and then the end products of digestion. Here we are talking about glucose, we are talking about amino acids. All these are always taken into the bloodstream through the process of diffusion. Because at the end of diffusion, at the end of digestion, the ileum will have a greater concentration of these end products of digestion compared to their concentration in the bloodstream surrounding the ileum. So these food substances will just be absorbed into the bloodstream through the process of diffusion. Also worth noting is that diffusion can play a very critical role in reproduction in plants, and this one they achieve by spreading fragrances. If you can recall from your primary science in reproduction in plants. Once plants produce their flowers, there's need for the flowers to be pollinated. That is, there's need for the pollen grains to be transferred from the anthers to the stigma. Then fertilization will follow later, leading to formation of seeds. And when the seeds are propagated, the plant is able to reproduce. You can recall you learned about various ways through which plants can have their flowers pollinated. That could have been through wind pollination or through insect pollination. But what is it that is going to attract the insects to the flowers? Diffusion of the scents. So the plants just need to produce the fragrances, then diffusion completes the job. Diffusion moves the fragrances from the flowers where they're highly concentrated to distant areas where the insects and other birds can detect that and then locate the flowers. And when they land on the flowers, either to get nectar, to get insects, or to get shelter, they end up transferring the pollen grains from one flower to another, enhancing pollination and ensuring reproduction in plants. At the same time, also, our bodies usually have specialized cells that facilitate communication through electrical signals. If you're walking in the kitchen right now and then you try to hold the saucepan and you find that it is very hot, you'll have to drop it off. Usually the part of the body that processes all information to do with the pain and excess heat is always in the brain, but we have specialized cells which will transmit that information to the brain to interpret and then give response immediately for your muscles to contract so that you let go of the hot saucepan. So while you will learn much more about this later on in Form 4, but it is essential for you to note that this process of transmission of nerve impulses also depends significantly on the process of diffusion. And of course, we also have translocation of manufactured food from the leaves to the other plant parts. The leaves are the main photosynthetic organs of plants. That is where food is always manufactured. But even the stem and the root tissues down there will always require the food manufactured in the leaves. So once food becomes manufactured in the leaves, they are then translocated, then moved from the leaves to the other parts of the plant. And again, diffusion, alongside other processes, plays a very critical role in that. Also worth noting is that diffusion plays a critical role in excretion of nitrogenous waste in unicellular animals. Unicellular animals are animals which are very simple. The entire animal is only made up of one cell, and they don't have complex excretory systems. It's made up of one cell. It can't have a kidney, it can't have the urinary system, it can't have lungs, it can't have the liver for excretion. All it depends on is diffusion. So once the gaseous metabolic wastes are produced inside the unicellular organism, they simply diffuse out of the organism to the surrounding region of low concentration. So even other complex organisms like us, also the process of diffusion becomes important in facilitating movement of metabolic wastes from the cells into the surrounding fluid before they are fully eliminated from the body. An examiner tip, a key tip I want to stress on here is the need for you to be very careful with the way you can be examined here. There can be a question asking you on the role of diffusion in living things. Here you can illustrate everything we have talked about. Then you can also have role of diffusion in plants. So you have to be very careful not to list down answers like absorption of end products of digestion, because that one will be in animals, not in plants. The question can also ask you for role of diffusion in animals. In this case, your response must be tailored specifically to the roles that diffusion plays in animals and not the roles diffusion plays in plants. So your response must always be tailored to meet the demands of the question. That underscores the significance of you underlining every keyword in the question before you commit to responding to it. But if the question is just general, describe the role of diffusion in living things, then you can list down any of the roles that we have just discussed. So the key takeaway for this session is that there's need for you to be able to define diffusion, movement of molecules from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. There is need for you to be able to recall some of the features of diffusion. It is a passive process. We said it does not require energy. All it requires, the only condition it requires is a difference in concentration of molecules between any two regions. And this difference in concentration of molecules between any two regions, we refer to it as concentration gradient. We can also refer to it as diffusion gradient. We also talked of the fact that diffusion involves movement along a concentration gradient, and it can occur either across a semi-permeable membrane or not. And of which remember the key experiment we have described. It's very important that you understand the selective diffusion process that is evidenced by that experiment. Then the factors affecting the rate of diffusion, there is need for you to be able to note them and describe them. And of course, significance of diffusion to plants and significance of diffusion to animals. And that brings me to the end of this session. And till the next session, when we'll be looking at osmosis, keep it safe and meet you in the next. Thank you.